Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this time of conversation. My name is Mitch Stutzman, and I serve as the Director of Development and Partner Engagement at Menno Media. Uh, Pleased also to have Amy Gingrich as a part of the call. She's our Executive Director at Menno Media. And pleased also to be joined by Lana Miller, who's a stewardship consultant for Everence Financial. And Lana is based in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Um, so Menno Media is in the business of faith formation, and we do that through the development and publication of curriculum, periodicals, and books to resource congregations and individuals as we all dive deeper into what it means to follow Jesus. And we at Menno Media are a nonprofit, and we are grateful for the support of donors who help sustain our ministry. And through my work in development, I get this chance to sit around kitchen tables and share cups of coffee with people who have included Menno Media in their charitable planning. And what I learned through those visits is that the vast majority of the time, we at Menno Media are not the only organization that people support. Folks are often including their local congregation in their charitable planning, mission agencies, relief agencies, their alma mater. The list goes on. And I celebrate this commitment to generous living. And it reinforces for me this importance of having conversations like the one that we're about to have today. Why do we give? In what ways is our generosity an extension and representation of who we are and what we value? And I'm grateful to Lana and her colleagues at Everence who've come prepared to help us think about that today. Everence is Menno Media's partner in generosity here in the States. And for those who may be participating in this session from Canada, our friends at Abundance Canada are a valuable resource in considering charitable planning within Canada. This is the first of a series of 3 virtual sessions that we're doing together in partnership with Everence. And the next 2 will focus more on the what and the how of charitable giving, but today we get to think together about the why. So at this point, Lana, I'll turn things over to you. Feel free to provide any further introduction that would be helpful and set the stage for the rest of our time together.
Thanks, Mitch. So as I think Abby's coming back on again. As Mitch described, I'm a stewardship consultant, and there's about 10 of us across the US who work in this kind of role. And ultimately, my goal is to provide education for congregational leaders, faith-based nonprofits, and also people who are attending congregations to think about stewardship, think about generosity. What does that look like, and what does that mean in their lives? So I also find in this kind of intimate space, I mean, there's only a handful of us, and yet we're being recorded. Like, how do we have the engagement of what it would really look like to grapple with this among people we don't even probably know, or some of us, we don't know who each other are. And sometimes that's also really freeing, but then when we're being recorded, who else might be seeing this in the future? So being able to, I think, unravel as much as you can, and within your comfort zones to be able to share as much as you can, or perhaps as I go along, there's things that really grip you or entice you and you say, I never thought about that. Or maybe you have some more questions. I can, this topic is so exciting for me. And for those of you who know me, I think Arthur and I just had a conversation this week. So I can talk and get so excited about all of these things. But I also want to be able to engage in some of the questions you're having, or even why you thought that this would be something interesting to participate and learn more about. So I won't have us go along and say who all we are, but I know you've all come for specific reasons and things. And if there's spaces in here that you say, this is really what I wanted to talk about, or what I wanted to think about more, invite you just to engage in that space in that way. So I'll share my screen just for a moment here. Mitch talked about Everence just a little bit, and I have a few slides here that talk about who Everence is and what we do. Ultimately, if I put it down to just very simple, our work is to help people think about how their faith and values are reflected in what they do with their money. It's really very easy, and yet I think so difficult, especially when we're surrounded by a culture who tries to tell us that what we do with our money is our own decision, that how much money we've made or what we have is because of our own merit, and is very different than a perspective of faith that says everything that we have is God's and belongs to God. The next slide is just, if I can get to it in a way, here we go. Just talks a little bit about Everence charitable services. And I think the unique part of Everence is the space of charitable giving and how we have opportunity to join people and even help people think and push out what giving means and why we give, which is the title of this session. Why do we give? And I think these numbers are just exciting to think about the fact that we can really work at distributing this amount of money through an organization like Everence, through the clients that we work with. It's just phenomenal to think about the ways that people are generous. As we work with people, we always start with this Vine tool. And if you look in the lower corner, it talks about discovering and planning God's purpose. Every one of us have unique gifts. Every one of us have different abilities. We're working with people who have a lot and who have little. So what does that mean as we think about the resources we've been entrusted with, the things that God has given us? What does that mean as we participate in what God is doing in the world? And so each person, that's going to look a little bit different. And so then what does living responsibly look like? Well, everybody's going to come out in some different places there. I think having some of those theological conversations about that are important. What does preparing for the future look like? How much is enough? When do we ask the questions of what is enough and how much is enough for me so that others can live? And what does that look like? And how do we start asking those questions? And then this idea of giving generously. What does it mean to be participating in the work of God in this world as people of faith? So exploring this why, I just have this as the title page because I went back to it thinking, okay, why we give, you can see my name, number, all of that kind of thing. But I'm going to take this down now because I really want to talk about this idea of exploring why we give. One of my favorite books recently is this one. It's not a mental media book, sorry. American Generosity, Who Gives and Why. So I work with Lake Institute, which has a school of philanthropy. And this author presented and shared some of her data, and just find it. So Patricia Herzog is her name, American Generosity, Who Gives and Why. And they give a definition of generosity, and I love it. On page 4 in this book, it says generosity is giving good things freely to enhance the well-being of others. Giving good things freely to enhance the well-being of others. And I assume that people who are drawn to this kind of conversation today, like exploring why we give, are probably givers of time, givers of gifts and various resources, givers of money. But why do we do it? Especially when the data would show, and this is where I find it so striking. So some of the data from this book came from 2016. 50% of Americans in 2016 did not give any money to any charitable causes. I find that to be a gripping and also theological kind of thing to wrestle with when we think about the fact that the US has so much wealth in comparison to other countries that 50% of the people in the US are not giving anything to any kind of charitable organization. Nearly 75% did not volunteer their time. Okay, this is not meant to be a doom and gloom kind of thing, but I think that some of this data is really fascinating. So 50% gave no money and 75% gave no time. There's more statistics. If you want more, get the book and you can read some more. We also know that there's a decline in the number of households that are giving. So in 2000, 66% of households gave something monetarily. In 2016, that number was down to 53%. And in 2019, which is the most recent data I have, that number is now down to 49%. Yet, largely, the amount of money being given is generally staying the same, which means fewer people are giving, fewer households are giving, but they're giving more. So we could ask, why are so few Americans participating in generosity? Or maybe we could ask, why do those of us who are giving actually give? And is it an important part of our own faith formation? Why are we giving? And does it shape us? Does it change us to be givers? Matthew 6:21, where our treasure is, there our heart will be. Does it shape me to give to Menno Media, or to give to my congregation, or to give to you, fill in the blank of the organization? If I'm giving, if my treasure is going to those places, how is that shaping and changing and transforming me? Sometimes we look at our giving as an impact of those who are receiving it. Yes, they're being changed. And sometimes I wonder what it would be like to look at, how is it that I'm being shaped and changed? How is the community being shaped and changed? What is God doing? And how do we tell those stories about that kind of transformation in a way that encourages future generations to participate and to be part of that kind of work? So that's the point today, to reflect in space, or to have time and space to think about, why do we give? How do we tell our stories? How are we inviting others to participate in generosity? It isn't a manipulative kind of task. Sometimes I think development people get a bad rap. They come knock on my door because I have money to give. And so then they think I'm going to give it to them. And it feels like a very transactional kind of piece. And maybe that's why people don't want to talk about it as much. Or maybe there's other reasons. There's lots of things connected to money, but the point is, often we don't actually even talk about it. So as we're
Did we lose Lana? Okay.
Seems like it.
Seems like it. Well, let's reflect on what. Oh, there she's back. You cut out for us, Lana, but now you're back.
Well, I was just saying, I've said a lot. So
you said it would be interesting to note. That was the last thing I heard. And then we were frozen.
Okay. So I'm back. And what I was saying at the end, and then I didn't realize I was even cutting out, was, so I've said a lot. What's staying with you? What are you thinking about? What questions are emerging? And if you don't have any, I'll continue going on. But
I have some, but I want others to ask them, not just me.
I'll also add that folks can unmute themselves and share this way, or you can use the chat function as a part of Zoom that you can find along the bottom, and type responses in as well.
So Abby just mentioned a kid here. That would actually be one of my questions. My kids are 10 and 12. And yeah, how do you build these habits among kids, generosity of time, of money, of those kinds of things. So tips there I'd be interested in. And also your numbers there were from 2016. I just put this book on hold in my library system. which happens to have one copy of it. But I'm curious what the COVID effect would even be on those numbers, and how some of that may have changed or worsened since then as well. Anyway, those are
So-
my two questions.
Yeah, everybody would like to know the COVID effect. And there's a lot of people who want to tell you that they know the COVID effect, but according to Lake Institute and the things that I've been trained in, there actually hasn't been enough comprehensive study yet to be able to give us accurate data for what's been going on. I mean, I think we all have kind of our own stories, and we can say from our own experiences what we think has happened regarding some of the data. We do know from Giving USA some of the recent releases of amounts of giving from last year data that giving tends to be down. But relatively, I mean, also, you know, our economy isn't at the most stable place. Like there's lots of like, so giving also follows kind of economy of things as well. And so there's a lot of, ultimately we're staying fairly level. And so I think that's good news. And yet this idea of households decreasing, I think if households in 2019 were decreasing, we also know that people's participation and involvement in organizations, congregations, impacts their giving. So if people feel connected and involved and relate to what's going on, they're more likely to give than if they're disconnected. And I think COVID was a time of disconnection. So I would say probably we're going to have some impact from that space and time as well. Children, that's a whole nother session that we can do sometime. And as a former youth pastor, I would just simply say, because this is what the data supplies to, is that what we model is also what our children learn. So how are we working to, in some ways in our own lives, even look at modeling what we do with our time and our money, because that's the biggest thing that impacts children as well. That's the short answer for that one. Other thoughts, questions, ahas?
Well, one of the things that stood out to me, and it actually connects with a comment you just made, was I appreciate the trying to frame the question as why do I give rather than why do other people not give? That's sort of my, evaluative. I'm always looking at that. And I think what stands out to me, or what my initial thought is, that I give because I see myself as part of something. And so there's kind of a sharedness in that. And I just wonder, it feels like people have different perspectives on that. There's generational parts of that, there's cultural parts of that. And so I'm just curious if everyone doesn't have kind of the same understanding of what it means to be in it together, how does that impact, or what does that mean for us as we think about giving or generosity?
Yeah, I think some of the congregations I've been in, picking up on that idea of comparison is born out of scarcity. And so sometimes we compare, what I'm giving. Well, they're not giving that. Why should I give more? Instead of it being, and I think as Anabaptists, what becomes more difficult is, what does it look like to think about giving as a communal practice rather than an individual practice? And so the comparison of, well, they're not giving their amount, so why should I, is born out of the scarcity mindset, instead of a sense of, what is the invitation that I have on my life to participate in these kinds of things? And as a community, what does it even mean to form systems of accountability, to have some conversations, recognizing that all of us are going to come at this. And I think this is what's been hard in the past. Like, we all have different amounts of money that we even have available to give. There are people who are living in poverty and are not able to provide enough food for their table and for their family. Housing to live, like, that's a reality. So what giving looks like in that context is different than for somebody who has a fairly comfortable lifestyle and is able to make ends meet. and provide for the basic necessities, and yet is giving about simply the amount, or is it also about the action or the space? And we'll talk a little bit more about that too. But yeah, you said a lot there, and that I just picked up on that part, and then yeah, I'll just pause. I'll stop for a minute. I want to go ahead. Were you going to say something, Denton? Oh, okay. It looked like you were reaching for your mute button. I sent this little autobiography paper. I made it up from a couple of different resources. And on the front of this paper, what I really find fascinating and interesting is to do a little bit of reflection. Why do we give? Well, what were our experiences? Amy, you were talking about how do we teach our children? Well, what were my experiences with giving growing up? Who are my role models? Who are the people who taught me about giving and generosity? What did I learn or perhaps not learn about giving and generosity growing up? What was taught in my congregation? What's the theology or beliefs behind giving? All of those things. And then my own personal experiences of, whether I get married or don't get married, children or no children, job loss at times, or death or illness, or all of these things can impact the way that we consider and think about giving and generosity at various times. And then there's even just transitional times within our lives. How much time do I have to give? How much money do I have to give? Depends sometimes in just the place and space we are in our lives. And so the first part of that, the first page of that sheet that was given to you is just a space to do some of your own reflection, not to answer each question individually, but to let them evoke your own imagination about what you have learned about giving and generosity as you have continued to journey throughout life at various stages, and who has helped inform how you think about it. The second page is really to go through and say, specifically, what does motivate me to give? And so, Arthur, you were talking about, are there generational differences? Are there ways that people think about this? And younger generations tend to think about things like, how are people's lives being impacted by my gift? They're looking for how the gift makes a difference. And in many ways, that's shared among all generations. That's the one kind of commonality. But your idea of giving together as part of a community could be somewhat unique, but how do we share those stories? And how do we even start to have those creative imaginations about why we give and how we think about giving? So the second part is just what motivates you to give. What causes resonate most deeply? There are so many things to give to that we can become inundated with opportunities to participate in giving. So how do you gain some clarity as a giver about what are your gifts? What are the things you're most passionate about? And what are the invitations that you have to participate in those kinds of things? As Mitch was talking about in the beginning, Menno Media would love to have you give gifts to Menno Media. And yet recognize that for those of you who are giving to Menno Media, there may be other places you're giving to as well. But what about giving to Menno Media helps you establish, how is that reflecting your faith and values? What are the ways that the other places you're giving to reflect your faith and values? And what we're really trying to help people to consider or to think about is, how are those things you give to really an extension of what you care and are most passionate about, and how you feel God is most passionate about what is happening in the world? And so it becomes most meaningful in that way when we start to even tell our stories. I think it's important so often, because giving is not talked about, and perhaps we don't tell the stories of why if somebody really cares deeply about an organization, we don't necessarily always even tell our children and grandchildren about why we care so deeply about that particular organization. Why has it meant so much for us to participate in giving to this particular place? How has that impacted me, my faith formation, my life, or how have I seen that impact the lives of others? I think those kinds of things become really, really important as we think about the next generation and what it means to continue faith development long term. See, Amy,
Yes,
unmuted.
I have a little story I'm going to share, Lana. So
Yes.
on this, our 10-year-old daughter, she would have been 9 last year at Christmas, she had been saving up her money and was going to make $100 gift to Mennonite Central Committee at the end of the year and had been talking about it. That's what she had chosen. And wouldn't you know, we get inundated with flyers that come in the mail, and World Vision sent something, and nothing against World Vision, but their flyer was flashier. And she was like, for all year, she'd been like, at the end of the year, I'm saving my money, and grandma and grandpa, give me more money so I can give it to my Central Committee. But she got that World Vision flyer, and boom, just like that, she's going to give it to World Vision. And so all year, I've been like telling the story, like, well, why were you going to give it to MCC? What's your connection there? Trying to tell those stories so that it's not the latest flashy flyer, because we can all do nice flyers. It reminded me that we all need really nice flyers too. But how do we tell those stories to our kids, to our donors, to one another about what matters most to us? Because people are out there looking for our dollars.
Mm-hmm. And it's not that all of the things are bad. And yet we only have a limited amount of funds. And where do we want to put those funds? And how do we want to engage? And in what ways do we want to engage? Because I think you bring up COVID. COVID has only exacerbated the fact that we all feel busy all the time. And that busyness and fullness is also part of scarcity. This idea that we don't have enough time, we don't have enough. And then it becomes, so how do we start to become more focused about what it is and who it is that we care most about, and what do we want to be part of and belong to? As Stuart, you were talking, as Arthur, you were talking about, being part of something. Well, what is the something we want to be part of that helps to tell our story and who we are and what we value and why? That's the why. So back to this. Back to this screen here. Just to say a little bit more about this idea of even how our faith guides what we value. There's certain stewardship principles, I think, that guide our thinking about generosity. And this idea that God created everything, Psalm 24, and everything belongs to God, is one that I think culturally we need to continue to combat, because we are in a culture where I've worked really hard, I've made this money, it's mine, I can decide what to do with it. What does that mean to participate in a space where everything I have is not mine? What does it mean to participate in a community with others for something bigger that God is about doing? Generosity is an act of worship. So often generosity is an afterthought, even within in a congregational context. Okay, now we'll take up the offering is often what's said, but what does it mean that giving is actually a part of how we encounter God? That we are invited and called, in fact, to manage the resources that God has entrusted to us, to know and be clear about who we're giving to and why. I have a definition of stewardship here in the next slide that kind of pushes that one out a little bit more. Stewardship is practiced in community, and we've kind of touched on that a little bit, but opposite of individualism, what does it look like to have us be part of and care for one another? I love Ched Myers, always has great things. about thinking about our money and what we do. But one of the things he and Walter Brueggemann and others talk about is the idea of the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant being present throughout the Old Testament and New Testament, thinking about the ways that we care for one another and are called and invited to participate in what it means to be community together. And that stewardship is a spiritual practice. It's something that doesn't necessarily come easily or isn't something that we just do automatically, but it does take some thought. It takes practice. It takes, repetition, and it forms us in our own spiritual lives. This definition of stewardship comes from John Cortina's in the book God and Money, that it's an active and responsible management of God's creation for God's purpose. And I think stewardship and generosity in these kinds of ways can be so easily, we can substitute the words. Generosity is active and responsible management of God's creation for God's purpose. It's not just about maximizing our resources, but living in a way that we can give in response to what God's invitation is for us. So I'll tell a story now. And I'm assuming, Mitch, you're looking at the chat. So if there's more questions that emerge. I was in a congregation, it was now 4 or 5 years ago, where we were talking about how much am I not, what can I not afford to give? And I was using the story of the rich young ruler. And then we just talked, I ended the session by saying, I would invite you to take this Everence pen with you this week. And as you go throughout your week, to be prayerful about what is it that God's inviting you to participate in? Because I think just like the rich young ruler, sometimes we're afraid to even talk about that story because Jesus was asking him to give everything. And yet, what is it that Jesus is asking us to give? What is it that's standing in the way of growing in our relationship with God? And so this week, as you see this pen, just reflect on that. The next week, a young man came back to me and he said, Lana, I've never been given that kind of challenge when it comes to giving, to thinking about what is it that God's inviting me to participate in doing. And he said, this week I took seriously what it meant to keep that pen with me and to be prayerful about God's invitation to participate in what God's doing in the world. And he goes, I am being changed. And I think that that's what we're all invited to. Why do we give? It's part of this formational piece. It should connect with our faith and values in a way that we get excited, we get enlivened, that generosity becomes something that just can pour out of us because we see how God is at work and we want to participate and we have the ability to do that. So I'll pause here just for another moment for thoughts, reflections, ideas. Let me leave you with a challenge then, and then I'll turn it over to Mitch. Why do you give? How are you writing your generosity story? How is God inviting you to participate in what God is doing in this world? May each of you continue to be open to finding spaces to explore some of these questions more deeply and invite others to join you in this journey. Blessings as you continue the journey of generosity. Mitch.
Thank you, Lana. we can pause here at the end and hear any additional reflections from those of you that have gathered for this conversation. Certainly those of us from Menno Media, Amy and I, as well as Lana, are happy to hang around for a little bit and visit. But I'll just say at this point, my thanks, Lana, to you for helping start the conversation into all of this. I am biased, having worked in the area of fundraising and finding my career path within generosity and philanthropy. It's a really valuable conversation, and I thank you for providing some handholds for us to navigate through this question of generosity as identity shaping. And again, Menno Media is in a place where we're grateful for folks that provide those charitable contributions to our ministry to keep that going. But as you mentioned, Lana, there's so many places in the world that are doing great work, and it's amazing to have the opportunity to sit in that space and say, how will I let my generosity be an expression of who I am and who God is calling me to be in the world? And that's wonderful work to be a part of. So I thank you for helping start that. What I'll do at this point is I will conclude our recording for this time, and then any personal sharing can also happen then offline. So thank you again, Lana.